Weapons at ready. It is time. We are the Emperor's chosen. Faith is our shield. None shall stop us. We stand ready, awaiting orders. Yes, my lord. Understood. Orders received, brother. Cleanse, purge, kill! For the Emperor! Space Marines, attack! Curse the monster! Securing objective. Onward to glory! Area secure. Under fire! Mission accomplished.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Chris.
And I'm Will. We're the Rat Boys.
Today, we'll be delving into the classic of RTS, Dawn of War, and all of its expansions.
We'll be ranking the game and its add-ons as a single experience for the most part, even though you could argue that each expansion is its own game.
I've never played any Dawn of War game. My RTS experience as a whole is pretty limited.
I, on the other hand, have been playing Dawn of War since its original release, but have never gone through the original campaign along with the Winter Assault expansion.
Before we get into it, let's review our scoring process.
We take 11 properties that every game shares and rate them individually.
We then average those scores together to get our overall personal score.
Then we average our personal scores together to get the overall score.
Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it.
Unfortunately, during this time of recording, Chris was out sick, so I'll be doing the rundown, story, and the game and mechanics. Dawn of War was originally released September 20th, 2004, and was later put on Steam in 2006. Developed by Relic Entertainment, who also made Company of Heroes, Warhammer 40k Space Marine, and Age of Empires 4, and was originally published by THQ, but was later acquired by Sega, who are responsible for Sonic the Hedgehog, the Total War series, the Yakuza series, and many more. The base game for Dawn of War is listed on Steam for $13 without DLC. With the DLC, it comes to about $38. There are 3 DLCs to Dawn of War: Winter Assault, Dark Crusade, and Soulstorm. Each DLC adds its own campaign, new factions, and new units. The typical time to beat throughout the DLCs and base game varies, but each can be cleared in a day or two of dedicated play. For the base game, Steam says, command the elite chapter of the Blood Ravens in an original epic tale of treason and conspiracy as you serve the Emperor and protect humanity from the scourges of the Warhammer 40k universe. I don't know if I'd use the word epic, but otherwise that's a vaguely accurate description. In reality, you take Commander Angelos of the Space Marines with 2 to 3 supporting characters and perform military operations to drive back the orcs and the forces of chaos. In the first DLC, Winter Assault, you pick between 2 campaigns, the Forces of Order or Disorder, and the quest for controlling a derelict superweapon called a Titan. The second DLC, Dark Crusade, is where things start to open up. You control one of 7 playable factions, and the objective being the same for all: take control of the planet. In the final DLC, Soulstorm, you again pick between factions, with 2 additional factions bringing the total to 9 choices. This time around, you're trying to conquer the entire solar system. The game seems to have one continuous story, sort of, but each edition seems to be its own thing. The overall gameplay here is what you'd probably expect for an old RTS game. You build your base while capturing control points and building up your forces to attack and defend. Each faction has its own special units and abilities, everything you would expect, but in a 40k setting. Mechanically, there's not much more to explain. In the base game, you just follow your campaign objectives. Winter Assault is more the same, but with a weird faction swap mechanic that happens mid-mission. Dark Crusade brings in a conquest campaign that you attack and defend territories of a planet whilst getting bonuses in-game. Soulstorm, the final DLC, expands and refines the concept of Dark Crusade. There's quite a few ups and downs to get through here, so let's get into it. As a reminder, we're rating this as a whole experience. We will share our thoughts on each installment later in the video. In Dark Crusade and Soulstorm, you get to pick from a lot of factions to go through the campaign with, each with its own unique playstyle, ultimate units, and abilities, which is to be expected, but at least they don't all feel the same.
I like the plethora of options you get for choices of factions, and the variety of options they have within themselves is also excellent. The ultimate unit that each faction had was neat in the way they were each unique. Baneblade was fun to play around with, just as much as I can assume that Squigoths were fun to play with as well.
In Dark Crusade and Soulstorm, you can equip your faction leader with gear that you unlock whilst progressing through the campaign and completing challenges. Most upgrades are the same across the factions, with a few unique choices. About halfway through the campaign, your leader actually feels overpowered, but not too overpowered in most cases.
The variety of troops and troop upgrades was actually really good in my opinion. Yeah, each faction had somewhat the same exact troops, but ultimately it gave you options to approach each obstacle differently. Did I ultimately use the same troops each match? Yes. But I still could have done so differently if I had the flexibility and speed to bounce between troops more accurately.
User interface, building, and resource management is all pretty simple. The UI is clear and only has a handful of buttons, so it's easy to navigate. Building placement boundaries are marked with a giant, translucent box that tell you exactly where you can and cannot place it. Resources are brought in by capture points and generator buildings, so there's less focus on making sure that your villagers are chopping wood and whatnot. This leaves you to have more focus on expanding the front line. All these combined makes managing the game a lot easier when compared to other RTS games.
The tutorial gives you quite a bit of information. Outside of it outstaying its welcome, it is very informative on what you need to do to build and capture points, along with upgrading units and researching.
There's a lot of different maps, and most of them are well designed across the board in my opinion. None of them are super unique, but most have good choke points, open areas, and they vary in sizes. For skirmish mode and multiplayer, you can custom paint your armies. This feature would have been really cool in the main campaigns, but alas, it's not there. It's still cool though.
Sometimes your troops get stuck on terrain, troops, vehicles, etc., and it seems to be a pathing issue. The characters are very clumped together, they don't move to the direction you tried to push them in. This persists throughout the games as well, unfortunately. It would have been nice if the vehicles could have pushed troops instead of just waiting for everyone to move. With that being said, transports were a nice idea, less clumping. But that doesn't mean anything for some reason still, because the troops will still somehow find a way to block you if you run everyone together. Best to keep transports in their own squad, unfortunately. So I guess that you can send them alone as distractions, but that's not what you want from a transport vehicle.
There are no autosaves in the entire game, but it's way more noticeable in Dark Crusade and Soulstorm. They really should have made an autosave after every fight at least. Instead, manual saves are allowed, but rat god forbid that you forget and your game crashes after a 2-hour fight. God damn it. An hour wasted. And it fucking, oh my god, dude, it doesn't fucking autosave! How's it gonna fucking crash?
On some points of the game, they definitely could have made the objectives more clear. There's a point where you have to play the Eldar in Winter Assault, and it doesn't tell you that you have extra troops, except in the objectives window, instead of placing that on screen. Then there's a point where you can't let your leader die or you fail the entire mission. This also could have just been put on the screen.
Not all factions are created equal. That's not to say any of them are unplayable, but support of some factions are just lacking. The clear preference to the devs was the Eldar faction. Eldar are arguably the strongest faction throughout the entire experience. Meanwhile, the Space Marines just seem to get nerf after nerf with every iteration.
After the tutorial, and then going to the first mission, the mission acts much like the tutorial, but with less signifiers showing what to do. Just highly repetitious and unnecessary filling. They could have just left the first mission to a non-tutorial instead.
The AI cheats. Specifically, the AI in Dark Crusade cheats. It's pretty bad. They seem to have infinite resources and can make advanced units without needing the required capture points. It seems to be able to produce units at a much higher rate than the player. The only information I could find on this is that the AI is supposed to get more resources, but no mention of anything else, besides the Reddit posts that have the same speculations that I have.
Your troops don't automatically respond to fire when capturing a point. At least they give you a notification stating they are under fire. But it's still kind of silly. I understand this is a mechanic, but it's an unneeded mechanic in my opinion. Maybe have one guy from the group grab the flag while others defend, but stay within the area and not run from the guy that's capturing.
The basic units for every faction is pretty bland for the most part. Like, it makes sense, and as someone who used to play the tabletop, it's pretty accurate. I just wish there was a bit more that you could do with them custom-wise. The Space Marines are the only ones who you can build the basic unit to be specialized.
Cover is pretty nonsensical at times. Sometimes it makes absolute sense on why this area would be cover, but other times, where? How does walking in an open field give cover? Later DLCs seem to make cover way more noticeable, outside of just having to hover over it with the mouse.
The keyboard controls are pretty outdated. You can't use WASD, and the hotkeys are all over the place. You cannot change any of the controls in-game. This is just kind of how things were when this game was made. It's not terrible, but it will take a bit to get used to.
The voice lines being stated every time you click somewhere is kind of annoying, but it's not something I consider deal-breaking. It's just way too much at certain times to me. Does it need to happen every time that I click somewhere? Even overlapping when people are talking within the context of story.
Prepare for my order. Emperor guides all. We must get their Land Raider transport safely through the psychic gates.
I'd care more about this if I cared more about the story from the games.
Since Dark Crusade and Soulstorm opted for a conquest campaign, this leads to having you play on the same maps over and over. Though even if it's not the same map, the AI generally uses the same tactics every time, especially in Dark Crusade.
Genuinely, the story. It's alright in getting you from place to place, and explaining why you've gotten there. But it does a terrible job of explaining who certain people are to the main cast. These main characters are also kind of forgettable, outside of the librarian, but he stands out because of the story behind him.
The default zoom out is still pretty zoomed in. I don't know if this was for performance or to keep you close to the fighting. Either way, it's way too zoomed in. But it's not bad enough to count it as a bad thing. It's just another thing that you're going to have to get used to.
Overall, visually, the game was pretty mid. Things were very blocky. There weren't sharp details. That's alright for the game considering it's about 20 years old. Ultimately, I think that each game was about the same. But visually, they did upgrade from Winter Assault to Dark Crusade by adding new visuals to stuff like the Chaos Marines bases. I'd say that the game's visuals overall equated to a 5.25 rats for the experience as a whole.
The visuals for this game does its job, and some improvements are made in the later DLCs, but overall it's pretty middling. I'm also not the biggest fan of the minimap. And finally, without changing some info in the INI file, the first 2 installments cannot support 1080p, so I give the overall visuals for this a 4.5 out of 10 rats.
The audio for the game was pretty average for the overall gaming experience as well. There were things that could drive it down, but the overlapping audio with voice lines wasn't horrible enough for me to put the game down to a 4 in the overall score. It was just average for me, so it's a 5 rats in the audio department.
This game's audio is okay at best. The constant talking, overlapping dialogue, and constant battle sounds is enough to give me a headache. Music is pretty unnoticeable in the entire game. The sounds themselves are fine, but when it's all happening at once, it's just noise. This is specifically an issue in Winter Assault. Overall, it's a 4 rats for me.
Dawn of War base game was an overall 4 in the storytelling department. Without getting into too much spoilers here, towards the end of the game, the Eldar tell you not to break something. They don't tell you why when you ask. Then they tell you not to do it again. They don't specify why exactly again, so you just break it. Then they say something to the effect of, "See, I told you not to break it. Look what you've done now. You've released the big bad evil we warned you about. Just say this is what's going to happen if you break it instead of treating humans like they're toddlers." Bruh. Anyways, Winter Assault went better overall. They had a bit more of a well-knit together story. It wasn't anything to write home about, but it was above the slop that was delivered in the base game. Then Dark Crusade and Soulstorm. They didn't really have a well put together story, since it was any faction for themselves. And these factions each have whatever generic ending they would have. Ultimately, downplays what storytelling could have been there. Also, the idea that Imperials are fighting Space Marines just because felt silly to me. Overall, I'd rate the story as a 3.75 rats.
The story started off good. Unfortunately, that also goes downhill after a bit. The base game and Winter Assault follows concise stories. They're both mid, but still solid stories. When they went to a conquest-style campaign, the story didn't matter anymore. No memorable characters, no goals, except for kill the guy. They could have done more, but I guess their priorities lied elsewhere. Don't get me wrong, I like conquest games, but this didn't start off that way, and it did not help the story. 4.4 rats.
Pacing was honestly good for the first game, and then the DLC right after with Winter Assault was also on par with base game. Pacing for the base game and Winter Assault was well thought out. You did whatever story mission, then you were told where you were going to go for the most part, and then you made it to said destination without issues generally. The overall narrative pacing was fine for that portion. Then you get into Dark Crusade. And personally, the pacing falls hard, mostly because you have to pick a place to attack. And then if you fell, it's essentially a loss of a turn while the enemy is continuously building up defenses because of your blunder, making you just constantly on the back foot, especially if you get backed into a corner on the map. It will be rough to even come back from. The newer game, Soulstorm, brought the pacing back to a manageable though, with how it settled on not allowing buildings to stay after whichever side ended up getting a victory. Overall, I'd give the pacing a 4.75 Rat Boys.
Pacing was okay. The base game in Winter Assault had a natural progression to it between story and the units unlocking. It felt like you were working towards something. Dark Crusade and Soulstorm gave you access to your units, but progressed the game in the form of war gear, honor guard units, and gaining territories, along with killing off other factions. Overall, it's pretty basic, but solid. 5.8 rats out of 10.
Honestly, this is a very mixed bag. Base game was actually really good as an introduction to the way they were planning on building the RTS system. Then Winter Assault came around, and the DLC was mostly good. Didn't fall off too much, and mostly kept everything the same, though characters felt overall weaker than prior. But it could have been just because you weren't playing Space Marines anymore. Dark Crusade. Honestly didn't like it. I'm not going to delve too deep into it. The constant enemy rush at the start of a match, and the feeling of not having any power to combat against it was quite overwhelming. Soulstorm, however, brought the game back to a good point in my opinion. So overall, I'd give the gameplay a solid 4.75.
Throughout the experience, one thing remained the same. Solid gameplay foundation. In-game, it's still build, capture, attack, and defend. The only thing is, the balancing through the installments seem to only restrict the player. For instance, base game would let you have multiple ultimate units, but later you're restricted to just one. It wouldn't be that bad, but the AI cheats, so it would help. But besides that, it mostly remained the same. Therein lies its own issue. Very few units were added to existing factions, and the units that were added were a bit underwhelming in my opinion. In the end, the blocks were there, but I guess they were just too heavy to move. 5.8 rats.
Mechanically, the game was sound throughout all iterations. Base game to final DLC of Soulstorm, getting requisition for capturing points, and then energy for generators was solid throughout each DLC and base game. And the different troops you have access to while building up your base was also good in my opinion. It felt like it flowed well for the most part, so it's a 6. It was just good.
Things started off strong for me, but as things went on, the cracks began to show. The constant game of rock, paper, scissors, shotgun got pretty tiring after a while. In the base game it was nice and simple. Then in Winter Assault they decided to do this weird split mission thing, where half of the mission is done by one faction, and the other half is done by another faction. In Dark Crusade the AI was just the worst, and every map kept whatever fortifications and capture points that was done previously. This can lead to a messy and frustrating downward spiral. Yes, you can be on the other side of this, but if you lose once, don't bother going back. Finally in Soulstorm, things go back up. You don't have any of the issues that Dark Crusade had, but overall, the mechanics here is just a 4.5.
Base game of Dawn of War was solid on character development. The Librarian and Force Commander do actually change over time, and have interesting development at that. Winter Assault was mostly average, but the main commander does get recognized for his contributions to the Space Marines as the game goes on. As for Dark Crusade and Soulstorm, kinda bad. You don't have much real character development, it's mostly just upgrading the character, which is nice, but it doesn't change the character and story, just their overall outfit, along with their stats. So I'd put this at a 4.25 out of 10.
As per usual, the base game started off strong. Then, it became almost non-existent. In Dark Crusade and Soulstorm, you get war gear, but that's it. Not much else to say here, unfortunately. 4.4 rats.
The games didn't really have that much world development in the latter half for the two DLC. First two games were kind of average on world building though. The base game did have a big change for world development. Then Winter Assault kind of kept it within the same ballpark, but made it mostly the same. As for Dark Crusade and Soulstorm, I don't feel that there is any real world development. Like yes, you change the world by taking over the areas on a world map, or solar map, but it isn't making any real changes narratively until the end of the game. So overall, I'd rate the world development as a 4.75.
In this game, world development comes in the form of level progression. The base game seemed like it took you all over the place, and it made sense. Winter Assault will make you sick of the snow and had really bad level design for the campaign. The other two installments at least gave you bonuses, and the conquest maps were decent. Unfortunately, there's not much else to say. 4.8 for me.
Overall, most of these games were fun. Dark Crusade was a burning diaper filled with rat turds, but the other games were good. Maybe I was bad at Dark Crusade, but I shouldn't have to be that good at the game to enjoy it. So yeah, mad 'cause bad or whatever. But the series of games gets a 4.75 overall.
Honestly, maybe I shouldn't have picked this game and just remembered it as fondly as I did. I've had this game since Windows XP, and I loved it, but now having to take the nostalgia glasses off, it's just not the same. Doesn't mean I hate it now, I just know that I won't be coming back to vanilla Dawn of War. The base game was solid, and Soulstorm would have been nice, but it just kept crashing on me after defeating an enemy, and I'm not about to scour the entire internet to fix it. It's just not worth the effort. This, with a heavy heart, is just a baseline 5 rats. I really hoped I would have loved the experience like whenever I was a kid, but the way we rank games forces the nostalgia glasses off, and some things just aren't actually as good as what you remember them to be.
Dawn of War base game didn't really have replayability from what I recall. There wouldn't be any changes. The only real replayability would have been online, since there's not that many factions in base game, pretty low on replayability. Winter Assault, you have mostly the same issues, but the different ending would give you a reason to replay. As for Dark Crusade and Soulstorm, honestly, there's quite a good portion of replayability. Wouldn't personally replay Dark Crusade, but I'd still say it has great replayability. Overall, 4.75. Soulstorm and Dark Crusade by themselves would be 7s though.
When it comes to replayability, I'm talking about the base game and the installments together as one experience. I feel like I have to restate that because not every installment is created equal. Honestly, Soulstorm is the only thing really worth playing over and over again if you were to put in the effort. And that's only if you can get it to work. 4.2 rats.
My final feelings on the series of the games as a whole, a 3.5. But ultimately, I'd say the highest rated of the 4 games was the first game with the final filling. Could be because of game fatigue, or just fatigue with Dark Crusade in general, but I didn't ultimately hate it. I just think it could have been better overall.
After going through everything, I was just feeling disappointed. Some things really should be left in the past. I gave this game every chance I could, and there was some enjoyment in there, but the glaring cracks were just too much. I felt myself more annoyed than happy going through all of this all at once. And honestly, in the end, it was just a 4.4 experience for me. I've been waiting years to have an opportunity to play this game again, and I can't say that I regret it, but it's definitely an eye-opener that not every game that you loved as a child is still good. Now we're going to talk about each installment on its own. The scores previously stated have already been factored into the upcoming section.
As a whole, the base game is a pretty good introduction for what you will expect going forward into the series of DLCs. It was solid mechanically, your units didn't feel underpowered. I'd say that the base game was very well done. They built a good chassis, put the next engine into. So I'd say that the base game, overall, was a 6.
When we started this, I didn't think the base game was going to be a high point, but it was. Not that high of one, but comparatively it was. Going through it once was fun and a good introduction, not to just the series, but also to get into RTSs altogether. The missions made sense. The story was solid for the most part. Cutscenes were laughable, but expected. Unfortunately, once you go through it once, there's not a real reason to do it again. And with that, it's a 5.5 rats.
Winter Assault was mostly forgettable for me. We finished it, and it went well for the most part. But overall, it wasn't as exciting as the first game, nor Soulstorm for that matter. It felt very bland. However, it had a better representation of the Eldar. They weren't complete jerks, but weren't willing to tell you what misfortunes would befall you if you didn't do XYZ. So overall, I'd say that Winter Assault was more a 4 on the score scale.
Winter Assault is a slight hit and a big miss. The Order campaign is way better out of the two, but still suffers from bad level design and that stupid split mission mechanic. I hated every second half of every mission on both of those campaigns. There's 5 missions per campaign, but it's not just the same missions but evil whenever you're playing the Disorder campaign. Every second to last mission gives you a choice on who you want to play in the final mission, but it's the same mission in the end, with little differences depending on who you pick. I cannot be bothered to do this again. 4.2 rats.
Dark Crusade was the black sheep of the entire bunch of games. It was far too unfair in my opinion. It could just be because of the bad AI. They needed to swarm the player as soon as possible so that you wouldn't get out of hand. But it just wasn't fun. That and you could literally back yourself into a corner by continually losing to the NPC. Each time they win, they keep whatever they built for the next time they get into a fight with you. It's just an uphill battle that could quite literally be unwinnable after a while. So honestly, I would probably give this game a 2 on the overall rating.
I remember liking Dark Crusade whenever I was younger, but this turned out to be a pretty bad time. I don't know what happened in the development process, but they fucked this one up. The AI has one strategy: rush your base, which they can easily do if you make one mistake. Doesn't matter what faction you're up against, you're always at a disadvantage, especially in the early game. If you can take over some map bonuses early on, it'll make your life a bit easier, especially the forward base bonus. But the only reason I think I got through this is because I went with orcs, and they have an upgrade that makes your basic unit cost 0 resources. The Green Tide was then unleashed, and as lore accurate as that aspect was, I still give this installment a 4. I have no idea how I dealt with this whenever I was a kid. If you're looking for a difficult time, this is where you go.
This honestly felt like it could be played properly again. They didn't allow you to keep your bases after winning, so NPCs also wouldn't do the same, and create that same issue from prior to put an immediate halt on progress you're making on the world map. Solar system? Either way, It was fun for what could be played. Unfortunately, once we beat a faction, the game would crash, stopping us from going forward with the full campaign. Still better than Dark Crusade though. I would give this game a 4 out of 10 rats.
This is the best addition to the game. AI is a lot more manageable, and each faction starts with its own map bonuses instead of starting out with essentially nothing. Basically, this is Dark Crusade 2.0. Most problems are fixed, although there's still clear favoritism towards certain factions. I have to go a little off memory because now the game crashes after every stronghold mission. I'm chalking that up as user error, but still something to be aware of as a possibility. Soulstorm is also the most moddable installment in this experience, and if you can get this to work, it's a solid 5.3 at least.
For my final average score of the base game and its 3 DLC, it was a 4.9 Big Boy Rats. Ultimately, the average would have been higher if it weren't for Dark Crusade. But even then, I would have loved to have had my troops able to mix and match between each other, like having infiltrators that have the ability to place mines or fix machines depending on what upgrade you choose for them. Even different upgrades for your vehicles in most cases would have been fun. Probably a bit too micromanagey, but it would create a good portion of replayability. That's just my thoughts on it.
My final score comes to a meager 4.7. This may ruffle some rat hairs, but I feel like it's an accurate score. I did not particularly like my return to Dawn of War. Even on its highest of highs, I didn't feel super great, even though I have very fond memories of this game. I just don't think the experience held up to the test of time. It's unfortunate for me, but this is just how it is. Take it or leave it. Combining our scores, the final score comes to a 4.8 rats. This is a slightly bad game when everything is put together. Definitely skip Winter Assault and Dark Crusade. Just don't put yourself through that. On the other hand, for the price, the base game might be worth picking up if you're new to the RTS genre. If you're just a fan of Warhammer and you like RTS games, pick up Soulstorm. I'm sure if you can get it to run right, modding it would create a fun time. And here's the kicker. Soulstorm is a standalone DLC, meaning you don't need any of the others to play it, including the base game. Both the base game and Soulstorm sit at $13 on their own on Steam. Speaking of mods, here's some suggestions. Starting out, we have a couple of complete overhaul mods. On moddb.com, we have the Unification mod, Dawn of War Soulstorm by Team Unification. This mod changes everything. New units, balance changes, new factions, texture changes, new game modes, the list goes on. This may as well be a new game entirely. It's been around since at least 2018, and from what I can tell is still being updated to this day. Do your research, but Soulstorm might be worth picking up for this mod alone. Second is Ultimate Apocalypse mod, Dawn of War Soulstorm, by official Ultimate Apocalypse mod team. Like the Unification mod, it adds all kinds of stuff to Soulstorm. This mod has been around since 2015, and I think it's still receiving updates. I know that their Discord is at least still active. And the last one on moddb.com is the Redux mod by Aranthris. This mod keeps the vanilla fill, but changes balance, some RE size increase, and a new armor system. This mod doesn't seem to be getting any more updates, but could still be worth looking into. Going over to the Nexus mods, we have two simple mods that the game greatly benefits from, and they're both from Daemon Jax. First is the Mild Camera mod. This mod simply adjusts what you can see, fixing the UI stretched look, and lets you see more of the field. And we also have the texture improvements for Dark Crusade, but may work on the other installments. But this mod just cleans up the textures a bit. Now those are just some of the mods for this game. There is tons more out there, so you could potentially have a much better game if you do your research. That about wraps things up for this one, boys. We hope that this review has benefited you in some way. If you want to come hang out, we're over on Twitch at RatKing0. We also have a bunch of old streams over on YouTube at Rat Boi Archive. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you want us to produce consistent content. Every bit helps. Until next time. Rat Boy's out.
For the Emperor! Yeah! Weapons at ready. Curse the monster!